Out from the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to High Heorot. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before. He knew the way, but never before nor after that night found Heorot defendedly so firmly, his reception so harsh. He journeyed forever joyless, straight to the door, then snapped it open, tore its iron and fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quietly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with a gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall crowded with sleepy warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together, and his heart laughed. He relished the sight, intended to tear the life from those bodies. By morning, the monster's mind was hot, with the thought of food and the feasting in his belly. Would soon know, but fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. Grendel snatched the first geat he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down, hands and feet, death. And Grendel's green teeth came together, snapping life shut. Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf with his claws, grasped at the strong-hearted wakeful sleeper, and instantly seized himself. Paws bent back as Beowulf leaned upon one arm. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh, and hide there. This was a different Heorot than the hall he had emptied, but Higlac's follower remembered his final boast, and standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastening those claws in his fists till they crackled, clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. His claws had been caught, he was trapped. That trip to Heorot was a miserable journey for the withering monster. The high hall rang, its roof boards swayed, and Danes shook with terror. Down the aisles the battle swept, angry and wild. Heorot trembled wonderfully, built to withstand the blows, the struggling great bodies beating at its beautiful walls. Shaped and fastened with iron inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Its benches rattled, fell to the floor. Gold-covered boards grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Heorot to stand forever. Only fire they had planned could shatter what such skill had put together. Swallow in hot flames such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. Suddenly, the sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemies sang in the darkness, the horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hell's captive caught in the arms of him who, of all the men on earth, was the strongest. That mighty protector of men meant to hold the monster till its life leaped out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised repeatedly, determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from side to side, trying to open a path for his evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. The sharpest and hardest iron could not scratch at his skin, for the sin-stained demon had bewitched all the men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every man's mortal blade. And yet his time had come, his days were over, his death near, down to hell he would go, sweeping, groaning, and helpless, the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Now he discovered, once the afflicter of men, tormentor of days, what it meant to feud with the Almighty God. Grendel saw his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast, Higelac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher. His power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulder snapped. Muscle and bone split and broke. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted a new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded, as he could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of a marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. He would come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had deep-driven affliction off, purged Heorot clean. He was happy. Now with all that night's fierce work, the Danes had served as he'd boasted, and he'd served them. Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel! And ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering, forced on Hrothgar's helpless people by a bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it was the monster's arm, claw, and shoulder and all. Canto 13. And then, in the morning, crowds surrounded Heorot, warriors coming to the hall from faraway lands. Princes and leaders of men hurrying to behold the monsters. Great staggering tracks they gaped with no sense of sorrow, and felt no regret for his suffering, went tracing his bloody footprints, his beaten and lonely flight to the edge of the lake where he dragged his corpse-like way, doomed and already weary of his vanishing life. The water was bloody, steaming and boiling in horrible pounding waves.
Hi, this is
Heat
Carol.
sucked from his magical veins, but the swirling surf had covered his death, hidden deep in murky darkness, his miserable end, as hell opened to receive him. The old and young rejoiced,
Yay!
turned back from that happy pilgrimage, mounted their hard-hooved horses, high-spirited stallions, and rode them slowly toward Heorot again, retelling Beowulf's bravery as they jogged along. And over they swore that nowhere on earth or under the spreading sea